There are people who leave loudly. They slam doors, they throw words like broken glass. They make sure you feel their absence before they disappear. But an empath leaves differently. It happens quietly. One day your phone stops lighting up with their name, the long messages become shorter, the warmth in their voice cools into politeness. You sit across from them and suddenly realize something unsettling. They're physically there, but emotionally, they already left weeks ago. And the terrifying part is, you probably never even noticed the exact moment it happened. Because empaths do not vanish during the argument, they vanish during the accumulation. It's the small betrayals, the subtle dismissals, the moments where they swallowed pain just to keep peace alive one more day. An empath can survive chaos, they can survive trauma, they can survive carrying the emotional weight of entire rooms. But there is one thing they cannot survive forever: feeling emotionally unsafe with someone they once trusted. And once that realization settles into their nervous system, something ancient inside them goes silent. Not dramatic, not explosive, just silent. Like a house where the lights are still on but nobody lives there anymore. Tonight, I want to show you the moment an empath begins disappearing from your life before you even realize you're losing them. Because the truth is, by the time they finally walk away, their heart has already held a funeral for the relationship long before their body leaves it behind. Keynote 1. The biggest mistake people make with empaths is believing their forgiveness means they are not hurt. You think because they stayed calm, they survived it. Because they understood your pain, they excused your behavior. Because they kept loving you, you assumed the damage wasn't real. But empaths are masters at bleeding internally. They will sit beside someone who is slowly destroying them emotionally, and still ask that person if they're okay. That's what makes them dangerous to misunderstand. An empath's first instinct is rarely self-protection. It's emotional preservation. They want harmony, connection, repair. So instead of reacting immediately to pain, they analyze it. They replay conversations at 2 a.m. They search for hidden wounds inside the people hurting them. They convince themselves your coldness came from stress, your distance came from fear, your cruelty came from unresolved pain. And for a while, that compassion keeps the relationship alive. But there is something people never realize about empaths. Every time they forgive without being understood, a small part of them emotionally detaches. Not because they stop caring, because caring starts to hurt too much. Imagine standing outside in freezing rain for hours waiting for someone to open the door. At first, you stay hopeful, then uncomfortable, then exhausted. Eventually, your body stops trying to stay warm. That is exactly what happens to an empath emotionally. The human nervous system can only beg for safety for so long before it adapts to disappointment. And adaptation is where the disappearance begins. You'll notice it in subtle ways first. They stop explaining how they feel. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they no longer believe being understood is possible. That's the stage people almost always misread. They think, finally, less conflict. Things are calmer now. They're not as emotional anymore. No, the empath is becoming emotionally unreachable, and that transformation is terrifyingly quiet. Because when most people are hurt, they become louder. Empaths become quieter. They retreat inward. Their soul starts pulling energy away from the connection the same way a dying tree slowly pulls nutrients back into its roots. You may still see them smile, still see them respond, still hear them say, "I'm okay." But deep inside, something sacred has started closing. And once an empath reaches this stage, they begin observing you differently. Not romantically, not emotionally, psychologically. They start noticing patterns instead of promises, energy instead of words, consistency instead of apologies. And suddenly, the person who once gave endless chances becomes emotionally impossible to reach. Not out of revenge, out of survival. Because eventually, an empath realizes something heartbreaking. You cannot heal in the same environment where your spirit learned to stay silent. That realization changes them forever. And the strangest part is, when they finally disappear, they often do it with love still in their heart. That's what people never recover from. Not the screaming, not the ending, the calmness. The way an empath can look at someone they once would have died for, and quietly decide they can no longer survive there emotionally. No hatred, no chaos, just distance. Cold, irreversible distance. And once an empath reaches emotional silence, the next thing they lose is far more dangerous than love. The moment an empath stops trying to prove their worth to you, the relationship is already standing at the edge of a cliff. Because for most of their life, empaths learn love through emotional labor. They become experts at sensing tension before words are spoken. They read facial expressions like survival maps. They memorize changes in tone the way soldiers memorize danger. And somewhere deep in childhood, adolescence, heartbreak, or abandonment, many of them unconsciously formed a painful belief. If I can understand people deeply enough, maybe they won't leave me. Maybe they won't hurt me. Maybe I can earn safety through emotional sacrifice. So they overgive, not because they are weak, because they are trying to create security through usefulness. They become the listener, the fixer, the calm one, the emotional oxygen for everyone around them. And at first it feels beautiful to receive that kind of love. You feel seen, chosen, understood in ways nobody has understood you before. But there's a hidden tragedy buried inside the empath's generosity. The more they pour into emotionally unavailable people, the more invisible they become to themselves. Their exhaustion doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly, like a candle burning in daylight where nobody notices the flame getting smaller. An empath will keep giving long after their emotional body has started collapsing. They'll reassure you while secretly drowning. They'll comfort you after you hurt them. They'll stay awake fixing conversations that you barely remember happening. And over time, something devastating begins happening inside them. They realize the relationship only survives when they carry it. That realization changes the entire emotional atmosphere. Because once an empath notices they are the sole source of emotional effort, they stop feeling loved and start feeling emotionally consumed. That's when the fatigue enters. Not physical fatigue, soul fatigue. The kind where even replying to a message feels heavy. Where hearing your name creates emotional tension instead of warmth. Where their nervous system begins associating your presence with depletion instead of safety. And this is the part almost nobody understands. Empaths do not leave because they stopped loving you. They leave because loving you started requiring them to abandon themselves. Read that again internally, because that sentence has ended more relationships than betrayal ever did. An empath can survive conflict. They can survive imperfections. They can survive your bad days, but they cannot survive being emotionally erased while trying to love you. At some point, the human spirit revolts against constant self-abandonment. And when that revolt finally happens inside an empath, it is almost invisible at first. They stop over-explaining. They stop chasing clarity. They stop begging for emotional reciprocity. Not because they no longer care, because they finally understand something painful. The people who truly value your heart rarely require you to destroy yourself to keep them comfortable. That awareness awakens a completely different side of the empath. A quieter side. A colder side. A side that begins reclaiming emotional energy instead of endlessly donating it. And once that process starts, their detachment becomes almost impossible to reverse. Because now they're no longer operating from wounded hope. They're operating from observation. They notice how rarely you ask about their inner world, how often your apologies repeat the same behavior, how their empathy became permission for you to avoid growth. And slowly, the emotional spell breaks. The person who once waited desperately for your attention begins craving solitude instead. That's the shift that shocks people the most. An empath alone is peaceful. They would rather sit in silence healing their nervous system than remain connected to someone who makes them feel emotionally homeless. So when they start disappearing, it's rarely impulsive. It's calculated by accumulated pain. Days, months, sometimes years of swallowing emotions finally crystallize into one terrifying conclusion. Staying here is costing me my identity. And once an empath feels that, their soul begins preparing for departure long before you see any physical signs. You'll notice they become harder to manipulate emotionally, harder to guilt, harder to control through inconsistency, because the version of them that tolerated emotional starvation is dying. And what emerges afterward is not bitterness, it's emotional self-respect. But there is one final stage in this transformation, one stage even more haunting than silence itself, because eventually, the empath stops mourning the relationship. and starts mourning the version of themselves that disappeared inside it. There is a moment in every empath's life that changes them permanently. Not loudly, not dramatically. It happens in silence, usually late at night, when the world is finally quiet enough for them to hear the exhaustion they've been running from. And suddenly they realize something unbearable. They have spent so much time trying to save other people, they no longer recognize themselves. That realization does something profound to an empath, because empaths don't just love people, they merge with them. They absorb moods, carry emotional atmospheres, internalize unspoken pain. For years, they confuse this emotional fusion with connection. But eventually, the body keeps score. The nervous system remembers every time they ignored their intuition. Every moment they said yes while their spirit screamed no. Every conversation where they abandoned their truth just to avoid conflict. And one day, the emotional debt becomes impossible to ignore. That's when the empath begins grieving. Not just the relationship, themselves. The version of themselves that became smaller to keep others comfortable. The version that apologized for having needs. The version that kept offering softness to people who only responded to convenience. This grief is unlike ordinary heartbreak. It is identity grief. And identity grief changes people at the cellular level. Because once an empath sees how much of their soul was traded away for temporary attachment, they can never fully unsee it. That's why their disappearance feels so sudden to others. But internally, it took years. Years of emotional negotiations. Years of hoping the bare minimum would eventually transform into real intimacy. Years of convincing themselves that inconsistency was love because unpredictability felt emotionally familiar. Empaths often stay too long because they can see potential in people. And potential is dangerous. Potential makes them fall in love with who someone could become instead of accepting who they consistently are. So they wait. They endure. They explain away behavior that slowly destroys their spirit, until eventually, reality collides with hope. And when that collision finally happens, something inside the empath hardens. Not into cruelty, into clarity. A devastating kind of clarity. The kind that whispers, if someone truly cared about my heart, why did loving them feel like surviving them? That question becomes the turning point. Because empaths can tolerate pain. What they cannot tolerate forever is emotional contradiction. Being told they are loved while feeling chronically unseen. Being needed but never nurtured. Being emotionally poured into only when convenient. Eventually, the soul rejects mixed signals as a form of emotional danger. And once that happens, the empath starts returning to themselves. Slowly. Almost cautiously. They begin listening to the feelings they ignored. Trusting the instincts they silenced. Protecting the energy they once gave away freely. And people around them often misunderstand this transformation. They call the empath cold, detached, different. But what they're really witnessing is an empath finally realizing that constant self-sacrifice is not love. It's survival conditioning. And healing an empath is strange because it doesn't make them softer. At first, it makes them quieter, more selective, more protective of their inner world. Because after spending years emotionally exposed, they begin understanding the sacredness of access. Not everyone deserves unlimited entry into their heart. That lesson changes everything. You'll notice they stop trying to convince people of their value, stop chasing emotionally unavailable connections, stop shrinking themselves to fit inside unstable love. And in place of that desperation, a new presence emerges. Calm, grounded, untouchable. Not because they no longer feel deeply, but because they finally understand deep feeling without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And when an empath reaches this stage, something unexpected happens. The people who once took them for granted suddenly feel the loss intensely, because the warmth that once held everything together is gone. The emotional safety, the patience, the endless understanding, gone. And what makes it haunting is this. The empath usually gave warnings nobody recognized as warnings. Not ultimatums, not threats, just quiet cries for emotional reciprocity that were ignored too many times. By the time they finally disappear, they are no longer deciding whether to leave. They are deciding whether they can ever emotionally return. And the answer to that question depends on one final truth. the truth most people realize far too late. By the end, an empath is not asking whether you love them. They are asking something far more important. Do I feel emotionally safe becoming fully myself around you? That is the question everything eventually comes down to. Because love alone has never been enough for an empath. Chemistry isn't enough. History isn't enough. Words are never enough. An empath listens beneath language. They listen to consistency, to emotional presence, to the feeling your energy leaves inside their body after you walk away. And when that feeling becomes anxiety more than peace, their soul starts preparing an exit long before their mind admits it. Most people think an empath leaves because they are too emotional. The truth is the opposite. Empaths leave after logic finally catches up to what their heart has been trying to deny. They notice the cycle, the temporary apologies, the repeated wounds, the exhausting pattern of giving second chances to someone who only changes when abandonment becomes real. And eventually, something inside them becomes unbearably tired. Not angry, tired. Tired of translating their pain into softer language so others won't feel uncomfortable. Tired of carrying emotional intimacy alone. Tired of hoping effort will someday become mutual. There comes a moment where the empath sits quietly and realizes, I have spent years watering a garden I was never allowed to rest in. That realization is the final fracture. Because empaths can survive being misunderstood, but they cannot survive forever in relationships where their emotional reality is constantly minimized. And once they emotionally accept that truth, they stop fighting for the connection. That's the moment people mistake for sudden detachment. But detachment is not sudden for an empath. It is grief that finished aging. It is disappointment repeated so many times that the nervous system finally stops expecting safety. And when that expectation dies, the empath changes in ways that feel almost eerie to the people left behind. The calls stop, the explanations disappear. The person who once fought desperately to keep the relationship alive suddenly becomes unreachable. Not because they want revenge, because they finally understand that love should not require emotional self-erasure. That understanding becomes sacred to them. And here's the part almost nobody talks about. When an empath truly leaves, they usually leave with sadness, not hatred. Hatred still contains attachment, emotion, investment. But sadness? Sadness accepts reality. An empath's final stage is acceptance. Acceptance that some people only know how to receive love, not protect it. Acceptance that being needed is not the same as being cherished. Acceptance that their empathy made them tolerate emotional conditions that slowly disconnected them from themselves. And once they reclaim themselves, they rarely return to environments that broke them. Not because they stopped loving you, because they finally started loving themselves too. That's the part people notice too late. The empath they once overlooked suddenly becomes impossible to replace. Not because empaths are perfect, but because genuine emotional presence is rare in this world. A person who truly sees you, understands you, forgives deeply, loves carefully, and stays soft despite pain. That kind of soul is uncommon. And when neglected long enough, even the softest soul learns to disappear. Quietly, completely, without warning. Like the tide pulling away from shore before anyone realizes the ocean has changed. And years later, some people still replay the silence of that loss in their minds. Not because the empath screamed. Not because they caused destruction. But because one day, the warmth was simply gone. And nothing else in their life ever felt quite as alive afterward.